Welcome to Sam Explains It All, a multimedia project meant to help you analyze the things you love. I'm your host, Sam, and today's episode we will be analyzing Homestuck and Psychology, Dave Strider and the Looking Glass Self Theory. My co-host today will be Mackenzie Sullivan. Kenzie, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'm a junior at Albright College. I'm a psych major, and I'm an avid Homestuck reader. So I guess those are my qualifications.
Yeah, Kenzie's probably the biggest nerd I could find to do this one, so that's why we brought her on.
Well, hey.
And now, without further ado, this episode is called The Psychology of Homestuck, Dave Strider, and the Looking Glass Self Theory. Starting off, I wanted to talk right at the beginning about the Looking Glass Self Theory, but I have to go a little further back. Kenzie, what do you know about William James's The Me Self Theory?
It sounds familiar, like something I've probably learned about in like one of those intro psych classes where they just kind of introduce you to the ideas of like the identity of a person and all that, but not too much about it.
That's all right. So the reason I bring this up is because Cooley, who made the Looking Glass Self Theory, kind of based the original theory off of James's The Me Self. The Me Self splits up an identity into three different parts, known as the material me, the social me, and the spiritual me. And I'm going to read a quote that's abbreviated from his original text in his original publication, which was known as The Principles of Psychology. It was a 2-volume series. He defines the material me encompasses the essential self, which is kind of like one's body, material possessions, and the product of one's labor. It is very grounded in what is physical about a person. The social me is fluid and multifaceted because it's anchored in social situations. It fluctuates, it's focused on how a person reacts to other people. And then the spiritual me is not so much a religious form of me as it is a collection of roles, values, and possessions that come to mind when thinking about oneself in the whole. So the reason why I kind of just wanted to start there was that it sets up the concept that there are different parts of a person.
I think it's a very interesting theory in how it tackles and breaks down like an individual's identity because it breaks it into three separate parts. And there's a big controversy in psychology of like how you can really break down one's identity, like if it's even possible or what way you would do it. And the idea of breaking it down based off like your body, your social interactions, and then your like collective consciousness is interesting in terms of like it tries to cover as much ground as possible while still differentiating
And it also
them.
it starts to bridge the gap, which a lot of people, even if you don't study psychology, you'll understand that you react differently in different situations. You kind of have a different self. And we're focusing on a little bit more of that social self, the social me, as James refers it to. And that bleeds into Cooley's theory, the Looking Glass Self Theory. Now, Kenzie, I do know you know a little bit more about this. So can you give us like a little bit of a basic rundown of that one?
Yeah, so the Looking Glass Self Theory is by Charles Horton Cooley. It kind of tackles what you were talking about a little bit earlier, which is a type of situationalism, which is where the person you are, the way you present yourself, changes based off what situation you're in, which is contrasted in psychology by another theory, which is more in the vein of like you have a baseline personality and it should be the same wherever you are. So the Looking Glass Self kind of builds the idea of the self concept by checking one's appearance in a mirror. Like a person sees their reflection and forms an impression about how others will see them. It's a theory based around how you interpret your own self-worth and self idea based off other people. It's very much based around like that social idea that the me theory has.
That pretty much covers it. So we do, before we get further in, there's a couple of facts I have to touch up on a little bit because the Looking Glass Self, as I read more about it, is kind of highly debated in the psychology community. And I mean, Kenzie, you can tell me if I'm wrong or right as I explain it a little bit more. But one thing that a lot of psychologists argue is that it doesn't really encompass how complicated the self is. The looking glass self theory, it's really hot. It's a really sexy phrase because it's super easy to remember. You're like, oh, I view myself as I view a mirror, and you get to use the analogy and everything. It's so sexy, but it doesn't quite do what it needs to do. And am I about right on that?
I mean, the easiest way to equate it would be everyone knows Sigmund Freud, the not quite actual psychologist, because he's not a doctor. I don't know why he gets the credit, but it's really similar to the way he broke down his idea of the person in three people, which is like with the id, the ego, and the superego. In terms of it's that same kind of like catchy idea, easy to remember mentality, but upon further inspection, it still leaves a lot where it's like, well, then how do you explain this? And then how do you explain this? But it doesn't mean that the theory itself doesn't have any actual merit. Like it's stuck around for so long because of for a
Well,
reason.
so one thing I found was there is a study published in 1992 called Autonomy and Conformity in Cooley's Self Theory, The Looking Glass Self and Beyond, and it's by Franks and Gekas. And what they do is they kind of break down what is ignored about the looking glass self theory, how Cooley had different elements to his theories and what they were meant to play a role is. The looking glass self was kind of like the surface level of his theories. It was like, here's this really fun way to say this, but as we dig deeper, we start to find a little bit more. There's It's a really good essay. It details a lot about what other researchers aren't doing and what some researchers are doing. I'm just going to quickly break down the four parts of the self theory that Cooley does go into, and then we're going to kind of outline the parts that are very important for this essay. So, one thing, as just a broad statement, Cooley really likes to talk about is that how the self, it's not just you kind of go up to people and they tell you about yourself. They're like, I think you're really cool. So you're going to go home and think about how you want to appear cool. It doesn't quite work like that because you as a person dictate whose opinions you care about and whose opinions you want to listen to. It's not just like an all-encompassing, you change your appearance and personality based on everyone. They have to have some kind of qualifications to you that make you want to change yourself.
I was gonna say that actually kind of ties into another very popular psychology theory, which is the idea of the self-fulfilling prophecy, which is if someone outlines a statement or has an idea about you, then as time goes on, they're more likely to see you fulfilling that kind of role. Like in that idea, if someone says you're cool, and then you go home and you think about it a little bit more, and maybe the next time you go out, you try to like exemplify those traits that you had when you were first with them, and they gave you that compliment, and it's kind of like they see you as fulfilling that prophecy they set out for
Exactly.
you.
That's kind of his rooted stuff is like at the surface, you yourself are trying to change how you're viewed because you think people want to view you like that, but it's not quite the end all be all of the theory. It's just the really punchy, sexy version of it. I'm going to keep calling it sexy because it really just is.
Psychologists everywhere are quaking.
Yeah, it's like every psychologist, if anyone is a psychologist, they're going to listen to this and they're going to be like, Cooley is not sexy. And then they're going to think of a different theory. They're going to be like, you know what's sexy? It's the autonomy of, I don't know, like
I'll tell
the
you what.
PTSD or something.
I'll tell
Like
you what's
some
sexy, the trolley problem. Now that. Ugh.
exact that one fucks. If I had to think of one psychology theory that fucks, it's the trolley problem.
Dear God.
So yeah, just as a basic outline, the Cooley's theory can be broken down into four different statements. The first is that reflected appraisal of others are actively interpreted by the actor. The second is that actors, to a large extent, select whose appraisal will affect them. So the first two is kind of that the beginning of the looking glass theory, where it's like, oh, you change your personality based on how people perceive you, and then but it is based on like the people you care about. The last two, the third and fourth, are not talked about as much, which the third is Cooley discussed the importance of relative stable transitional sense of values that allow the person autonomy from the immediate appraisal of others. So it's kind of like an ego extension, and it's that concept of like you make something your own. It's supposed to be very physical in that like people will make extensions of themselves into the physical world, which is again why the me self goes into this theory.
Mhm.
The best example I can think of is anecdotal a little bit, but when I was in high school, everyone associated the musical Jesus Christ Superstar with me. Everyone. I would get constant texts when people would go out and they'd find vinyls of Jesus Christ Superstar, and for 2 years straight, all I got was memorabilia from that musical. And so basically that self theory is that because of how I presented myself and people associated that part of me with that object, they started rooting my personality into that physical manifestation.
So it's like if you stake your flag on a hill and you're like, I'm gonna die on this hill, and everyone starts to associate, oh yeah, they really like that. Like if you say, oh yeah, Jesus Christ Superstar, greatest movie of all time, and then anytime it's like brought up, they're like, you know who really loves this movie? Sam Phillips.
Exactly. And the fourth one goes a little bit further. I think it's rooted in it's the beginning of another theory. And again, Kenzie, you're the expert here, not me. So the fourth is stating that in his writings on appropriative behavior, Cooley argued for relatively autonomous yet social dimensions of self-formation based on feelings of efficacy, which is just a really fancy way of him saying that like children watch their parents, who's ever watching over them, and then they will take actions and things that they view from that person and repeat them. So if he sees his parents, like, let's say there's a little kid and he sees his parents talking about taxes, he's going to go in the other room and he's going to lay out a bunch of papers with his stuffed animals and be like, you need to file your taxes.
It's like when kids play house when they're like young, even though they have no real concept of what goes on. And I think that ties into the idea of modeling, which is where kids, especially when they're growing up in that sensitive part of their life, they'll look to adults, people that they see as having more information about what's going on in the world around them, and they model themselves in their behavior after them as a way of like trying to grow up and understand as much as that person would.
Exactly, which I think is very important because when we're talking about the looking glass self, we are kind of talking about that very spunky, you perceive how people view you and then you try to replicate that. But we're also digging a little deeper in how this self is formulated. And because we're talking about a character throughout this, I really want to talk about how all of these are exemplified and how bits of this theory do showcase themselves.
I mean, I will say, just from what you've talked about here, the wording he uses and how he always describes the person as an actor is really telling for what this theory like thinks about people as a whole, in terms of you're only really yourself when you're with yourself. Like every time you go out to interact with people, that's you putting on a show. And when it's like when you were talking about the second qualification, when they were talking about people choose what opinions matter to them, that's kind of like an actor to an audience. It's a matter of saying, I want you to be impressed with me. I want you to think good of me. And so I will put on that show to do so.
Exactly. So now we're going to go. I've got some more stuff about this, but I want to save it for a little bit later when we really get into the comparison. So now I want to talk a little bit about Homestuck. And I'm going to throw some of the history behind it, which is very important to this particular theory. But Kenzie, again, can you give us a little bit of like, what was your experience with Homestuck?
So Homestuck it's got a soft spot in my heart for a long time, just because I remember reading it or attempting to read it for the first time when I was in like seventh grade or so, failing horribly. And then a couple of years later, I was in an art class with some friends and they were talking about it. And I was like, this sounds like a great story. What's it called? And they were like, oh, it's Homestuck. And I was like, are you serious? If anyone who's read Homestuck knows, the first few pages versus the actual like epic of the storyline itself are wildly different.
I'm actually the reverse of Kenzie in that, and there's a reason I chose this particular theory and publication to utilize for this is because I was rooted very heavily in the Homestuck fandom back in the day. I remember the Act 6 publication, and I also remember going into cons and I wore the gray makeup and everything. I made an awesome car cat.
And you called me a nerd.
But it is actually very rooted in my concept of self, Homestuck, because it helped me go along and try to figure out little bits of myself that I wasn't quite ready to confront. And it was actually through the character of Dave Strider, which is why I did want to talk about this. Homestuck, to kind of give the history about it, it was originally published in 2009. And what it's described as, it ran from 2009 to 2016, and it consists of over 8,000 pages with various media formats. It's often been called like the Ulysses of the internet, and Litwiller, in his 2013 analysis, said it was a genre-fusing postmodern epic designed for and produced through the internet.
It's a much
Uh,
more formal description than I'm used to associating with Homestuck.
I know, right? That's the thing is once you go into academic theory, you find crazy stuff for things that you thought was just huge nerd things. A lot of people have even called it's basically made of pure internet. It's almost a time capsule because of what it talks about, some of the elements it uses. Someone 10 years from now won't quite get it as much as you and I get it right now.
Which makes sense because so much of its storytelling is rooted in like references. And like you mentioned, it ran from like 2009 to 2016. It ran for almost the entirety during the Obama presidency. And like that is brought up a surprising amount considering
Oh,
how
so
young these kids
much.
are supposed to be. Like, I don't remember if you read the epilogues a lot, but Obama becomes a character in it. And
Jeez.
like it clearly shows like it's a product of its time, but rather than shy away from that, it full force embraces it.
And I remember too, back in the the early 2000s when Obama became president, everyone was just it was partially joking, everyone was relieved, but everyone's like, man, that Obama guy, what a guy. And it was part of the internet. It was absolutely part of the internet.
Especially because the internet was on such a rise at that time that like finally people had an open space to share their opinions about things like politics and create memes about it to like jokingly laugh about it.
One of the reasons we have to talk a little bit about the Homestuck's history is because it goes right into the autonomy of the characters and also how the audience influenced it. So, for the first 3 chapters of Homestuck, they were created based on suggestions from readers. So, there used to be a forum where Andrew Hussey, the creator, would go in and ask for suggestions on the characters. And in the like the physical versions of the Homestuck book, he has an annotation where he states all character names were taken from reader suggestions. John Egbert was the first suggestion for his name, so I used it. For the second character, Rose, I used the second name suggestion. For the third, Dave, I used the third suggestion, and for Jade, the fourth. So the audience actively participated in the beginning parts of Homestuck, especially on the first 4 characters, because their actions were rooted in what the audience wanted. So a lot of the text dialogue that happened was the audience asking for things and reacting to things. So the characters were formulated not just on the original creator, which was Andrew Hussey, but also on the audience themselves.
It's actually interesting that you bring that up because I just did a research study on Homestuck and its history and stuff. And one of the things I talked about was how audience participation never really ceases with Homestuck. Like there are artists who do panels, there are musicians who do music, there are like story writers and everything, but it's never really that original direct audience to writer participation than it is in the beginning. Like that was
Mhm.
it was straight up people writing in what they wanted to see, as ridiculous as it is. And I think if I remember correctly, one of the first panels is like, "What's his name?" And it's like Zoosmell Poop Lord. Like
It's a pure internet medium. And the reason why we have to talk about this a little bit is because we are going to be talking, and here we're back at the beginning of the podcast, Dave Strider and the Looking Glass theory. We're going to dig a little bit more deeper into Dave Strider's character, and then we're going to wrap back around. So, Dave Strider, Kenzie, do you want to take this one away?
Sure, I'll get you going. So Dave Strider, for anyone that doesn't know, is the second character or third character, I'm sorry, that's introduced in the comic. He is the epitome of cool, or so he would like to present himself as. He lives in Texas with his older brother, and he has 3 friends that he primarily talks to: John, Rose, and Jade. He has a collection of swords. He mixes beats. He has a fond interest in taxidermy and photography, even taking unironic cool selfies of himself. And speaking of unironic, he has a bit of a weird obsession with maintaining irony, so much so that to the point that it almost like makes it confusing to read him because he doesn't even know what he seems to be saying sincerely. And as the story goes on, you get to unwrap more and more about Dave's life and his history and his relationship with his brother, especially, and how he's grown up in a way surrounded by these internet friends and how his life is quite different to theirs.
Exactly. So one and very important part of this and how the comics medium in particular goes into this is that the story of Homestuck is told through the point of view of John Egbert. That's not always the case, but even when you're being other characters, it is still largely a story told through John Egbert. So your first interaction with Dave Schrader is through John Egbert, which means you are confronting a character through that mirrored lens that we're kind of talking about. You don't get Dave Schrader, you get the perception of him based on how John talks about him, how he talks to John based on his text and everything. The audience has to contextualize this character without a whole lot of information because, again, this is a comic rooted in the internet. You are meeting him through the barrier of the internet.
It's actually funny that you keep bringing up like this webcomic exists as a form of internet medium, but in the comic itself, the idea of the internet and its relationships is super important because for the characters, John and Dave too, they met through the internet originally as well. Like their first interactions, much like our first interactions, are through the point of view of someone else, through a persona that they're presenting online.
hmm There's a theory that a lot of this is also rooted in, or not a theory, but an analysis. Julie M. Jones wrote a paper called The Looking Glass Lens Self Concept Changes Due to Social Media Practices, where she went in and interviewed a number of YouTube stars and how their reaction of being on the internet and how it has changed their perception of self. Now, her study kind of culminated into this theory that people's perceptions of themselves changed after being on the internet as they intook a lot of information from people. So they actively changed how they viewed themselves, what they felt about themselves based on how people talked to them. Hers is kind of largely positive, where she talked about, in her theory, a lot of the people talked about how they felt better about themselves, they felt more body positive, they felt more outgoing, all that kind of stuff. We are kind of taking that and we're taking it a step further because we are analyzing a character.
Hmm.
But long story short of it, in her analysis, she does talk about how social media changes people's perceptions, and she kind of bases it on the concept that a digital media can serve as a mediated mirror, and social media sites provide the space where others' judgments are clearly posted. So instead of having the looking glass be conceptual, it is actual a physical barrier that they are working through, and that's how Dave is introduced through this mediated mirror.
I feel like a lot of times with the internet and the discussions of like privacy and all that, you have like usually two opposing viewpoints. The idea of you let someone go online, you make them anonymous, and they'll say their most honest opinions, regardless of how cruel or exciting they are, versus the opposite side of that, which is you give someone the opportunity to quote unquote be themselves online and they try to create like an idealized version of themselves, hiding all their flaws and repressing all the things that actually make them a human.
hmm And that's kind of where we're starting with the character of Dave Schrader. Tim Glaser, in his essay "Homestuck as a Game," he has this one little phrase that I really really like, where he says, "They are only able to express their individuality with their username, text color, and writing quirks."
Oh, I like that. That's a good quote.
hmm And that's very important too, because you got to remember that we're working through a comics medium. One thing that Andrew Hussey does is that he has the big panels and then he has just a buttload of text. And so every panel starts you off in this physical dimension. You physically see the characters. And then you have to confront them and their personalities and everything about them through the text medium. So the only way that they get to be themselves is through these filtered versions, or again, the mirror that Jones talks about.
And the idea of it like being a literal mirror of like your computer screen looking back at you, and the like you can't just go out and act the way you want to be seen. You have the color that you're writing in and the punctuation you're choosing to use. And it's like I feel like Andrew Hussey does a great job in actually writing these characters because you can get such a clear distinction between the types of writing styles and who characters are just by like a few conversations. But I don't know, I just feel like Dave as a character really shines when he's just rambling. No punctuation, no flowing between the sentences, just like walls and walls of red text.
Exactly, because that is probably the purest form of self he has throughout the comic until later on. Because another thing that Andrew Hussie does, and I don't know if he did this consciously or unconsciously, I really hope consciously, was at the beginning they all go by taglines. Dave is TG, which is Turn Tech Godhead. And so he is that personality. He is that Turn Tech Godhead. It isn't until he meets the other trolls and other people that he becomes Dave.
You know, I never really thought about it because whenever I remember when they get to that shift in the comic where they go to by referring to real names, it usually happens like when the kids finally get the chance to meet in person, and it's like there's no more need for those internet handles. But at the end of the day, they probably would have been like calling each other by their real name, not their usernames, for as long as they've known each other. And yet it's still like he's hiding behind that visage, the visage. This what's the word? How do you pronounce this? Visage?
I think it's visage.
Okay, so he's hiding behind this visage of the online persona, the cool rap spitting cool guy who does nothing sincerely, and he has a great web comic that's super popular, and his bro knows everything. It's so ungenuine.
Yeah, disgenuine.
Disgenuine.
It's very true. And that's kind of why I wanted to talk about this character in particular, because his whole story goes through his concept of self. Because he starts off with such a mirrored self that is reflected from how his friends interact with him, his environments, things that he's associated with, watching his brother. All of Cooley's theory is largely rooted in the character of Dave Strider. And before I go further, for all the academics out there, I want to put a little anecdote on this. As we go through this, I will not be talking about Dave Strider in reaction to Andrew Hussie, because I'm following the Roland Barthes statement, The Death of the Author, which kind of just goes through that a character is kind of property of the audience because the birth of the reader must be at the cost of the death of the author. That's a direct quote. And that a text unity lies not in its origin, but in its destination. So we are talking about Dave Strider as a character by his audience viewpoint, not necessarily what Andrew Hussie directly stated. Because Dave Strider is kind of cohesive throughout the audience, and there's some people who will argue with me on this, but we are taking him as the character, not as the author's property.
Well, like Dave is a character is like very clearly a fan favorite among like the fandom itself. And I feel like The Death of the Author is a great way to examine this, just because Andrew Hussie, while really great at crafting this great story, can get a little confusing if you just follow him on social media.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's also important too because I think Dave Strider, and if someone wants to put little stars in their head around what I'm about to say, this is the key point. Dave Strider is a reaction of the Looking Glass self theory comes from his friends, the audience, and the author. All three of those elements affect him as a character. It's not just the characters, it's not just the author, but the audience directly influences him, as stated before, that they were affecting the story.
And when you say the author, do you mean like Andrew Hussie as like the entity, or Andrew Hussie as in like the character itself in the comic who has sway over the universe?
As the author, his reaction, how he depicts Dave Strider, puts that Looking Glass self theory into play, because how the author views Dave is sometimes a direct conflict to how the audience views Dave and how the characters write out and play Dave. And so the character of Dave Strider is this mediated Looking Glass self because he has to conform to three separate divisions of people's thoughts on him.
Could I even raise you one more, and it's his perception of his brother and his thoughts on him? Because I feel like at least at the early part of the comic, that's a decent part of what shapes him as a character.
Absolutely. So four different divisions is that, and we're going to talk about them in turn. We're going to kind of give examples, but they all come into play on how Dave views himself, and it isn't until he actively is stripped of all of these theories and viewpoints, and when he becomes kind of back to Andrew Hussey but still rooted in the comic, that he comes back to be what he wants to be.
His original true self, which is kind of his character arc of the comic.
Mm-hmm. So I have Dave's introduction pulled up, and you gave a really good breakdown of it. But it's as we start to confront the character that we say that as he goes through his story, his fear of puppets, his perception of his brother and everything, that we start to get it broken down. And so I think where I really want to start with this is I want to talk a little bit about some of the major characters that influence him. Namely, I want to talk about John and Karkat.
Ooh, okay. Good characters.
So let's start with John, because he's the titular character and he's kind of like the main boy of the series.
His BFF, his bro for life, his number one homie.
Exactly. John is he's kind of just the catch-all. He's the bumbling hero, which we all love. And that's a very important factor because Dave compares himself a lot to John throughout the comic. I have one conversation he has with Terezi, which has probably one of the most memorable quotes that people can pull of Dave to try to argue why he's a good character. And he says, "I'm not a hero. My bro was. John is. I'm not."
I remember reading that part in the comic, and it's like, isn't it at like quite a literal moment of doing something that's basically heroic, like pulling a sword from a stone?
He's actually pulling the sword out of his dead brother.
Oh, that's so much worse.
And he can't do it, so he has to break it from the midsection.
Which is kind of a great way of him embracing the idea of like, well, like you said, he's not a hero, and he's not even going to try to embrace it because he knows he ain't going to follow through on it. So he does it his own way.
So let's kind of talk about John's perception of Dave and how it both hurts and helps him. I think the big one is John's letter to Dave, where he talks about how he is a cool kid and he can't be as cool as him, and you know what, it's not a big thing. And he gives him glasses, the Adam Sandler glasses that Dave wears ironically to begin with. And so there's two dividing forces in John's letter, because on one hand, he's reaffirming this concept that Dave has to be a cool kid with no emotions and yada, yada, yada to live up to his friend's expectations. But on the other, John is actively giving Dave an out from the personality that his brother tried to thrust on him.
And when you say like John is kind of enforcing that idea of the cool kid mentality, I don't think he's doing it intentionally. I think it's just a matter of this is the reality he's been presented. This is the Dave he's been presented with. And he doesn't really know anything other than that, even though he suspects that perhaps he might be looking for a way out of the shadow of his brother.
Oh, absolutely. That's one of the Achilles heels of the looking glass self theory, especially when it's utilized in literature, is that if a person is presented someone who is already a looking glass self version of them, they will just continue to go along with it. And so the original person, in this case Dave, doesn't want to divert from that because it's what people expect of him. It's what he's expected to do. He doesn't want to change parts of himself, especially as the whole world is ending. And during this time, Rose went crazy and they're confronted with trolls. Like, the last thing he wants to do is start to confront his perception of self.
Because he's doing exactly what his brother had trained him to do. He's being a hero. He's fighting. He's trying to save his friends. He doesn't have time to self-analyze how maybe he had a kind of messed up upbringing. Maybe he should think about deeply who he is as a person. He's just got to go, 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 go.
And I think that bleeds right into Karkat. So, Kenzie, I want you to we haven't talked about the trolls at all. So could you give us just like a quick breakdown of that?
So basic rundown of the trolls in Homestuck is there's 12 main beings. They are aliens from a planet called Alternia that exists in kind of the same universe as Earth. The 12 main trolls are all based around the zodiac. And the planet of Alternia has like certain rules that are different than Earth, but also kind of highlight some of the flaws within Earth's system. For example, all the trolls have different blood colors, and depending on that blood color determines like their rank in society. In terms of how this applies to Karkat specifically, he has the red blood that a human would have, but on the trolls planet, that's considered like mutant blood, and therefore he's like downcast from society. If he'd ever been discovered, he would have been killed, and so it puts him in like a very vulnerable position. And he tries to cover up by being very brash. And then it also ties into the other major part of like the troll society, which is their romance system, where they have no idea of sexuality or gender. It's more of an idea of there are 4 quadrants based off the suits of cards, and each of those quadrants represents a different kind of romance that all trolls should strive to have. There's like the basic romantic romance, there's a kind of hate romance, there's a friendship romance, kind of like uh, what's the best way to find it? Just like best friends that like are in like a committed relationship with each other.
They're just best buddies forever. It's the BFFF or what best? I guess it would be like BBBFF. Best
BFF
friend.
extend forever and ever and ever and ever and ever.
Yeah, like you just okay. So it'd be E. So it's BFFE
For infinity. And then
exactly.
And then the last quadrant is kind of a 3-person quadrant, which bases around the idea of one person making sure the other 2 don't actually kill each other because they all kind of need each other around.
So just like a business meeting.
Pretty much.
In romance. Yes. That's like the sexiest way I could put it, is just you are in a business suit and you are taking care of 2 rabid raccoons.
And so help you God, if the raccoons start attacking each other, you're the only one that can tear them apart.
Exactly. Like that's your whole purpose, is to tear them apart by just being like, no, you love each other. Sort of. Like, don't do this.
And like the idea of the troll society is that each person should strive to fulfill all 4 of those quadrants, even though just from the sounds of it, it can clearly get a little complicated considering how many people could be involved in these quadrants.
It's also good to state that this was originally a satirical take from Hussey. He wanted to make fun of internet shipping, so he created the quadrants, and everyone was just like, hey, wait, hold up. This is pretty good.
This man's might be on to something here. Hold on.
He's big brain playing it. Yeah, that's basically the rundown of them. And our main boy, Carcat, is very important because he ends up in probably one of the most committed relationships with Dave. I mean, even most of Dave's friends, they're very close to him, but it really is Carcat who pulls a lot out of Dave. The only other person you could argue is within the comics would probably be Jane, but even then, it's not quite the same.
Jane or Jade?
Jade.
Ah,
sorry. Misspoke.
I was gonna say, really? Her?
That's just hot mom. That's just hot mom right there.
Oh, honey, hot mom is evil in the epilogues. We don't stand.
She's evil in like the comic. I can't read the epilogues. That's just on me though.
Save yourself the trouble. It ain't worth it.
Noted. But yeah, let's talk a little bit about Carcat's relationship with Dave. Basically, long story short, they hate each other and then they love each other. Just to flat out put it out there.
Which is like the progression of their relationship is very much like, it's very antagonistic for a long time. And then you see them after there's a 3-year shift between the comic where you don't really get a lot of dialogue about what happens in between those 3 years. But in that time frame, Dave, Carcat, Rose, Kanaya, Terezi, and then
Gamzee.
Sometimes Vriska.
Gamzee's there.
Is he? No one likes him.
He is, because he's sleeping with Terezi. That's like a whole plot point. Come on, man.
I was talking about retcon. That's a whole other thing.
Well, yeah.
But for the base part, it's like those people on the media for 3 years, and they have nothing to do but wait and get to know each other and watch shitty movies.
It's similar to Jesus, how you go from 8 to 30. That's kind of that's going to be my goal, is I hope I can bring Jesus into every one of these discussions, but not bring religion into it. I just kind of want to like throw him in there. Like someone's just talking about, they're like, yeah, you know how when you're drinking wine, I'm like, yeah, like Jesus.
Like Jesus did that. My homeboy.
This is why everyone associates Jesus Christ Superstar with me.
You got Jesus on the brain.
I got Jesus on the mind, man. I got heaven on their minds, as they say in the musical or opera. It's technically a rock opera.
Can I ban you from your own podcast? Is that a thing I can do?
No, it's called Sam Explains It All, and unless you can find another Sam, it's me.
Damn, I guess I'm stuck.
Yeah, you're stuck here now. So let's talk about Carcat and Dave. So one of the reasons why Carcat hates Dave at the very beginning is because he doesn't believe he's a cool kid. He really is like, no, you're lying. You're not a cool kid. You are so messed up. I can see it. And no one believes him. No one believes Karkat at the beginning. They're like, no, you're just jealous of Dave because he's so cool. And Karkat's like, no, I mean, a little bit, but no.
It's funny because when you look back on their interactions after like having watched or read the comic and knowing what Dave's like backstory is, you get the idea of like, damn, how did I not see it before? He was right all along.
Exactly. And that's part of Karkat's issue is he is right all along. He's just so uptight that he doesn't know how to
Express
revel
it.
in that. Yeah. And so it really that's one of the reasons why Dave kind of keeps coming back to Karkat is he kind of he wants to prove something. I mean, overall, if Karkat stayed out of his way, he'd be happy. But that's one of the reasons why they're so fascinating to look at is that Karkat actively challenges Dave's perception of himself. He is the first character to and the audience has started to go against this too. I mean, during that time, a lot of fan art, a lot of analysis about what Dave is like as a deeper character, especially when it goes to Dave's sprite, which I'm not going to get into right now, but that's a whole other can of beans. But how the audience has come to view Dave Schrader, because Hussey's kind of just dragging us along, and he's provided various analyses, but he's kind of stayed congruent throughout all of it that Dave is this cool kid and all of that. But it's Karkat who is the first character to really be like, no, this is bullshit.
And the same way you were talking about earlier, how like the looking glass for Dave is reflected in like his friends and then the audience and the author itself. The author presents this like form of Daze. The audience gets an impression of it, and that's where like headcanons and that fan art you were talking about comes into play. And then the actual characters themselves get to look at him and like interact with him in a way to either like maintain that idea of the mirror image self or to try to unravel it, to look behind it.
Mm-hmm. And that is kind of what we're talking about here is that as one character starts to unravel this concept of self, the whole comic starts to follow suit. So in the looking glass self theory, as people change their opinion, it's the kind of the second tenet, I guess, of the theory is that you only change yourself to people you care about. So when Dave starts the comic, he cares about his brother, he cares about his friends, he cares about like the audience and the author. But as the comic goes on, one, it challenges the audience to think about what the author is playing the role in and how much they get to change it because they have an active influence in it. But it also challenges, like, who does Dave start to care about? He starts to lose the care of his brother, and so he kind of picks it up from other places.
And I feel like when you talk about the second tenet of that theory, which is like assigning importance to different people's opinions, I feel like we could kind of talk about how Dave's brother, Bro or Dirk, really hurt Dave in a way that he experienced for almost the entirety of the comic and very much experiences later on in his life, if the epilogues are be anything to go off of. He's very much been shaped by his brother and how his brother wants him to be. How he believes what's like the right thing, the ideal hero, the great guy, the perfect man.
Yeah, I have up Dave's conversation with Dirk in the later part of Homestuck, where he's talking about what Bro did to him and his own trauma with that and everything. And Dave says, there's no way it would have resulted in anything resembling reconciliation, which I think was something I kind of needed, but didn't realize it. So thank you for being a really plausible stand-in for him who I could rip to shreds while still being basically innocent of all that terrible garbage. So you end up sort of being like an avatar for him that is much easier to forgive.
Which is kind of a devastating thing to say to someone who is essentially a different reality version of your brother who has hurt you in unimaginable ways. But it also was like a way for him to finally express just how much he understands he was hurt.
Yeah, and that's an important part because Dave can't become someone else. He can't become devoid of that looking glass self theory until he gets rid of the perception his bro put on him, like the turntables and all the physical manifestations of that, but also the mental manifestations of that.
And to tie back to like what you were talking about a little earlier, I feel like one of those perfect ways of seeing that is when John gives him the glasses, because up to this point in the comic, Dave and his brother, bro, have all been wearing like these same pointy anime shades. And on his birthday, John gives him these glasses, which were from Ben Stiller, I think.
Yeah, Ben Stiller's sweaty face. Or was it Adam Sandler? No, it was Ben Stiller.
One of the funny
I
mans.
think. Yeah, one of them.
And it's like a chance for him to really say, I, as your friend, know that you value his opinion, but I also feel like you can have a chance to express your own opinion too. And I feel like that's kind of why Dave considers John such a good friend to him, because he gives him that chance to say, I'm going to be a little bit of my own person right at the beginning when it still feels impossible.
Exactly. And so that's kind of like the root of this theory and why I really, really, really wanted to talk about Dave Strider in Compendium. Because to go on a little anecdotal rant, I was debating my gender back in the early like 2010s. I was really debating whether I felt I was a girl or a guy. And from a very personal experience, I know a lot of people felt that Dave Strider was trans. Like they saw bits of themselves reflected in him. They actively enacted the looking glass self theory into this character because they imbued him with their own struggles. So to see him not know how to conform, to continually try to become something that he wasn't, to work around the opinions of everyone around him, a lot of people related to that from different experiences, but I do know that a lot of trans people related to that.
I feel like that's a great way of expressing just why his character is so like well beloved. Just because a lot of like the mirror glass theory, but I'm applying to like the audiences themselves. A person can look at this character and say, "I see myself in you," or maybe not entirely, but I see bits and pieces, and that's what makes me love you because I can reflect upon that. And I feel like it gives people a way to look at themselves from an outside perspective, looking beyond the mirror and say, this person, this character handles it this way versus how I'm a person in like our reality is living this life.
It's coming to a point where either like you decide to strip yourself of the looking glass self theory or you take the positives that people feel toward you. So Dave, he doesn't quite devoid himself of the looking glass theory because he starts to listen to what people around him say. They're like Carcat's like, I'm here for you. I value you as a friend. You're really witty. Rose backs him up on a lot of stuff. All of his friends surround him with an element of praise or validation that he utilizes to formulate his new sense of self. And he also he strips himself of that. His whole journey is trying to realize who he wants to be and who he genuinely is.
And I feel like he does a lot of that through comparison, because I know one part of the looking glass theory is like the idea of by interacting with others, you expand your inner world. And in how that applies to Dave, it can be difficult to realize that the situation he was in was wrong and cruel without comparing it with others his friends who we can see are living in a society where that's not okay, or the trolls where they live in a society that's arguably much crueler than his, but even they aren't like held up on the same hangups he has. It's a way of really like expanding his worldview by just looking deeper into his own friends.
Yep. So at the end of the day, Dave's whole character kind of does formulate like, here's the looking glass self theory at the beginning as you're introduced to his character. Well, you're introduced to his character and you're like, oh, he's a cool kid. And you don't even realize how you, the audience, how John, all of these characters have formulated his sense of self. And then they deconstruct it throughout the comic and then build it right back up to what he wants to be.
Which is kind of what I feel like good friends do, is they help you realize if you're at a point where you don't really like who you are, and they help you try to find your way to being a person you want to be.
That's exactly that. And he learns how to get his good friends around him. All right, so Kenzie, we're going to tie this up with a neat little ribbon, and I need like a really punchy line from you to give us like the general gist of this.
Oh God, I'm not good at one-liners. Okay. I feel like the looking glass self theory is really good when it comes to trying to understand a character at their base level and about why they act the way they do. But when you go below the surface of that mirror, there's so much more that can be explained. And it's only by getting rid of it that they can really be who they want to be, their version of themselves that they like, not just what other people like.
Very sexy. I do Wonderfully appreciated. Well, thank you all for listening. This has been Sam Explains It All. Please follow me on Twitter from the same handle, on YouTube, and any source where you get your media. I'll be posting more in the future, and check out our Twitter for updates about where you can help and how you can request more information. Again, this has been Sam Explains It All. I'm Sam, and our co-host.
Oh, hi, I'm Kenzie.
And we appreciate for you listening, and thank you, and have a wonderful week or time or whatever passage of time works.
Bye.